Okay. Hi, Daniel. How are you?
Hi, Douglas. Doing well and great to be talking with you.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it. It's nice to have you. When I first looked at your book title, I thought it said The Man in the Moon. And I had to look at it again. It's not the man in the moon, it's the mind in the moon, right?
The Mind and the Moon.
Okay, very interesting title. According to your bio, this is kind of a story of your brother. Is that correct?
So it is. It begins with my brother. He's really the inspiration for the book, which is both very personal and then also scientific. I he, when we were in our early 20s, was diagnosed as bipolar, put on a locked ward, given heavy medication and told he would need to stay on heavy medication for the rest of his life. My parents were terrified. They were told he would likely be suicidal without the medication. And I, he's also an artist, a pianist. He couldn't perform, couldn't play as he wished on the medication, went off it after several years, and with some hiccups in his late 20s and early 30s, has really lived a flourishing life ever since. And that raised all kinds of questions for us about the way we think about our psyches, about the biomedical approach to psychiatry, the emphasis on pharmaceuticals that has held sway since the 80s right up until now. And so the book is an attempt to tell his story, tell a couple of other very intimate stories, and then also spend time with scientists who could shed light on where we are in terms of understanding our brains, our minds, our mental health.
That's it's very interesting, and I didn't know that your brother was an artist, and I want to bring this up. I don't think I've ever mentioned this on this show, but there was a period in my life where I went through a kind of a severe depression for one thing or another. And the doctor put me on Zoloft for a little while. And exactly the same thing happened because I'm a musician, I'm a writer, have been my entire life. And as soon as about a week into taking that medication, nothing happens the first couple days. It takes like a week or two to build up into your system. After a week or two, I couldn't write anymore. I had no creativity whatsoever. It just shut down that part of the brain, whatever it is. I think it's the right side of the brain, they call it the creative side. And I just sort of, I wasn't a vegetable. I didn't get to that state, but it just disrupted my ability to be creative. And I hated it. I would go to the piano, I would try to write a song, I couldn't write. And finally, after about 2 months on this thing, I told the doctor, I said, I'm not taking this anymore. I said, this is ridiculous. I can't do what I love to do. So eventually, I got off the medication and, just fixed a few things in my life that were causing me the depression. And I'm okay, right? But let me ask you something about your brother. Now, how old was he when they diagnosed him bipolar?
So it was pretty classic. We were both in our early 20s, and this was the early 80s, so long ago, when psychiatry had just sort of offered up the biomedical view that says our minds are the same as our brains, and we can understand our psyches through our brains and medicate our psyches as if they're any other organ in the body. And as your powerful story just attests, our minds are not quite our brains. And I want to just leap ahead in a way to what one of the great researchers of the last decades taught me. He's a great researcher into depression, spent his whole life looking for pharmaceutical approaches, and would say to me bluntly, look, a half century has gone by, we've made no progress. And this was a common theme among the scientists I spent time with. But he made this point: take the heart, complex organ. Its cells do what the organ does. You can watch its cells pumping blood. You can do this with any other organ in the body except the brain. neuron cells do not think. The point is, the brain is so much more than the sum of its parts that we really can't talk about it in pure physiological terms. It has a beautiful mystery to it. And again, your story just exemplifies that. And so these drugs, I'm not saying people leave your drugs behind, but I am saying these drugs come at a cost. We don't really understand how they work. They work only some of the time for some people. There may be other ways to think about our psyches, to think about our creative selves, and to address our mental health.
Well, they're not a one size fits all. They're definitely not. Some people, they have been a miracle cure, and they have lived normal, productive lives with the medication. Without it, they could have been a mess, all right? But for some people, they do not work, and in fact, they destroy that part of your life which you find dear to you. And it has to be done on a case-by-case basis.
Right. And I think that is what psychiatry has failed to do. It's that individual approach. Psychiatry has claimed, and again, this dates back to the 80s and continues to this day, has claimed this authority about our psyches, despite the fact that we really don't understand how our minds, how our selves come to be. And it's not just me saying this. I mean, as I set out on this book, the New England Journal of Medicine did a lead opinion piece called Psychiatry in Crisis, saying just that the biomedical approach, the emphasis on pharmaceuticals, has kind of led us astray, and it hasn't led us to understanding. The World Health Organization last year said much the same thing, asking us as a society to start to consider other ways of understanding. Just quickly, the other main character of the book, this woman, Caroline, defies all expectations. She would be labeled by conventional psychiatry very psychotic. She hears voices, has visions to the extent where she would sometimes ask me to repeat a question because her voices had drowned me out. And yet, just this morning, we were emailing about Melville and Willa Cather. She's a fully coherent human being who is leading a movement trying to, in a way, lead us to a new understanding of how our minds and ourselves work.
Is your book a biography of your brother?
The book works like straight journalism. I mean, it's all based on the tapes.
It's a report of your, okay.
So it is absolutely nonfiction, but it interweaves three personal stories, my brother's, Caroline's, who I just mentioned, and a man named David, a actually quite heroic civil rights lawyer who's battled with depression and anxiety. It interweaves those stories with the stories of two, or if you count it, three very accomplished scientists whose labs lead me into our brains in ways that fascinated me, I hope will fascinate readers, but who were also very candid about the walls that physiological psychiatry, the idea that our brains are the same as our minds, the walls that has run into. So it's an interweaving of the very intimate with the scientific.
I'm kind of working in reverse here, but I'm curious, what was it about your brother? What sort of symptoms was he displaying when they determined that he was bipolar?
Well, it's interesting. He would reject the diagnosis of bipolar, but he would say, I was clearly in crisis. We still have some of the hospital records, so there'd be no question that he would meet the criteria that conventional psychiatry sets. He was acting erratically. He, according to our parents, believed that he could cure our grandfather of Alzheimer's. So the hospital records talk about his believing in special powers, etc. So these were the kinds of things. So there's no question about the diagnosis in the mainstream psychiatric sense. And yet the question that's raised is, we're always told these things are permanent. We're always told these things, if not medicated, will lead to disaster. That isn't quite what the evidence shows. And so there's this dichotomy. Conventional psychiatry is geared to risk management, to prevent the absolute worst. But the question is, at what cost? And as your story exemplifies, the cost in your case was your artistic self, this essential part of yourself. And maybe that's too high a price to pay. And we have to rethink the balance, find other ways to preserve both our lives and ourselves.
So is your brother off the medication now? I think you said he was, right?
Yeah, for 30 odd years, if I'm counting right, and doing wonderfully. And one of the moving things that I'd barely realized when we started this project, he now as a volunteer goes on to psych wards. As I mentioned before, he's a pretty accomplished musician, goes on to psych wards, plays for the residents or patients there, and coaxes them into sing-alongs, which are really moving events.
All right. I think we'll leave it at that because I don't want to give away the whole book, and we're just about out of time. So thank you, Daniel, for coming on the show. Do you have a website for the book or a personal website you want to give out?
I do. It's just straight danielbergner.com, and the book's out tomorrow. I hope people will be as fascinated by the science and the explorations of self as I was. And Douglas, thanks so much for the conversation.
Best of luck with the book. You